The ballroom went quiet the second I set my pen down on the check. Not the polite quiet of a room between courses. The real kind. The kind where 140 people who'd spent the last hour pretending not to watch me suddenly stopped pretending. Grant Ashworth was still smiling when I stood up. That smile stayed on his face for maybe 4 more seconds before it started to slide, the way ice starts to slide off a roof in March, slow at first and then all at once. I didn't say anything to him. I folded the receipt, slid it into my jacket pocket, and looked at my wife. "I'll be in the car," I said. Claire didn't move. She sat there in her navy cocktail dress with her hand still wrapped around a champagne flute she hadn't touched in 20 minutes, and she looked at me like she was trying to figure out if I was the same man she'd married 9 years ago. I walked out of the Sheraton Ballroom on 4th Avenue in downtown Seattle at 9:47 p.m. On a Friday in October, past the coat check, past the valet stand, past a photographer from the Puget Sound Business Journal who'd been hired to shoot the event for the company newsletter. I didn't look back. I got in my truck. I sat in the parking garage for 11 minutes with the engine off, staring at the concrete pillar in front of me, and I thought about the fact that I had just written a check for $240,000 to a man who, 40 minutes earlier, had told an entire ballroom that I was worthless. My phone buzzed at 12:14 a.m. Claire. I let it ring twice before I answered. "Nate," she said. Her voice was already breaking. "Nate, what did you do? I want to tell you how we got to that ballroom, because the $240,000 check wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the end of one. To understand why I signed it, and why I walked out without a word, you need to understand who I am, who Grant Ashworth is, and what happens when a man spends years underestimating the person sitting across the table from him. My name is Nathaniel Calloway. Everyone calls me Nate. I'm 39 years old. I grew up in Yakima, Washington, in a house my father built with his own hands on a half-acre of land he bought with cash he'd saved working construction for 11 years. I still remember the smell of sawdust in that house. I remember my father's hands, cracked and calloused, the hands of a man who'd never once complained about a 14-hour day. I have one brother, Marcus, 2 years older than me, who runs a heavy equipment rental company out of Spokane. Growing up, it was the two of us and our parents in that house on Fowler Street. For rooms my father framed himself on weekends over the course of nearly 3 years, working nights and Saturdays while he held down a full-time job pouring foundations for a contractor named Hollis Brantley. I remember being 9 years old, holding a flashlight so my father could see the wiring in the crawlspace, and him telling me, without looking up from the wire nuts in his hands, that a man who builds something with his own 2 hands never has to explain its value to anyone. I didn't understand what he meant then. I understand it completely now. My mother worked the register at a hardware store on Nob Hill Boulevard for 19 years. She used to bring home paint chips and drywall samples that customers had left behind, and Marcus and I would build little houses out of them on the kitchen table, arguing over which paint color belonged on which wall of our imaginary mansions. I think about that a lot now, that the first buildings I ever designed were made of discarded paint samples on a laminate table in Yakima, and the buildings I own today are worth more than every house on that street combined, several times over. I didn't go to a fancy university. I went to a community college for 2 years, transferred to Central Washington, and got a degree in business that nobody in my family understood the value of but everyone was proud of anyway. My father drove 3 hours each way to attend my graduation and cried during the ceremony, which I'd never once seen him do, not at weddings, not at funerals. Afterward he shook my hand instead of hugging me, which was his way, and said, "Now go build something that's actually yours." I started working in commercial real estate straight out of school, first as a leasing associate for a firm in Spokane, then as an acquisitions analyst in Portland, learning the parts of the business nobody teaches you in a classroom. How to read a rent roll. How to spot a building that's underpriced because the seller doesn't understand what he's sitting on. How to walk into a room full of men who assume you're the assistant and let that assumption work in your favor until the moment it stops being useful to you. I learned early that being underestimated is not always a disadvantage. My first mentor in the business, a woman named Ruth Okafor who ran acquisitions for a regional fund in Portland, told me during my first month on the job that the biggest asset a young man in a cheap suit has in this industry is that nobody in the room thinks he's a threat until the closing documents are already signed. Let them misjudge you, she said. Just make sure you're never the one who's wrong about the numbers. I never forgot that. I built an entire career on it. By the time I was 29, I'd saved enough, borrowed enough, and learned enough to buy my first building. A 12,000 square foot mixed-use property in Ballard that everyone told me was a mistake. It wasn't a mistake. 18 months later I sold it for double what I paid, and I used that money to buy 2 more. 10 years later, I run a private holding company called Callaway Property Group out of a modest office on Western Avenue. We own 14 buildings across Seattle, Bellevue, and Tacoma. Total portfolio value, as of the last appraisal cycle, sits just north of $91 million. You would not know any of this by looking at me. I drive a 2015 Ford F-150 with 210,000 miles on it because I like the way it drives and I've never seen a reason to replace something that still works. I wear jeans and flannel to most meetings unless I'm closing something. I don't wear a watch that costs more than a car. My father raised me to believe that money you have to show people isn't money, it's a costume, and I've never forgotten that. Which brings me to the problem. Because the way I live, the way I dress, the way I carry myself, tells a very specific and very wrong story to people who've never bothered to ask a second question. And for the last 4 years, one of those people has been my wife's boss. I met Claire Delgado 7 years ago at a fundraiser for the Woodland Park Zoo, of all places. She was 27, working as an account coordinator at a mid-sized marketing agency, and she had this way of talking about client strategy that made a room full of donors who didn't care about marketing suddenly care. I watched her handle a difficult board member for 10 minutes without ever raising her voice or losing the thread of what she was saying, and I thought, I want to know what that feels like from the inside. Being that composed. Being that sure of your own competence. We dated for a year and a half. In the early months, Claire assumed, the way most people did, that I worked some modest job in property management, because that's how I described myself the first night we met, and I never corrected the assumption, not out of dishonesty but out of habit. I liked the way she talked to me before she knew what I owned. I liked that when she asked about my day, she was asking about the actual day, the tenant disputes and the roof leak on the Ballard building and the contractor who was 6 weeks behind schedule, not about a number in a bank account. I told her the full picture about 4 months in, on a Tuesday night at a diner in Fremont, mostly because I'd just closed on my 4th building and the paperwork was sitting in a folder on my passenger seat and I didn't want to keep hiding it from someone I was starting to think I might spend my life with. She was quiet for a long moment after I told her the rough size of the portfolio, and I remember bracing for the conversation to change, the way it changes with some people the second they find out what you're actually worth. Okay, she finally said. Does that change what you want for dinner? Because I still think we should split the mozzarella sticks either way. I fell for her harder in that exact moment than I had in the 4 months before it, because it told me everything I needed to know about who she actually was underneath the ambition and the polish. I proposed at Kerry Park, which is about as unoriginal a place to propose in Seattle as exists, but she told me once that the view of the skyline from up there made her feel like anything was possible, and I wanted her to feel that on the day I asked her to spend her life with me. We got married in a barn outside Woodinville. 110 guests. My father gave a toast that made half the room cry, mostly because he doesn't talk much and everyone was so surprised he had that much to say. Claire's parents flew in from Sacramento. It was, by every measure that matters, a good day. For the first 3 years of our marriage, Claire worked her way up at a boutique agency downtown. She was good at her job. Better than good. She had instincts for client psychology that took most people 15 years to develop, and she had them at 29. When Ashworth Vane Creative recruited her 4 years ago, offering her a senior account director title and a 40% raise, I told her to take it, even though something about the interview process had made me uneasy. They kept asking about my husband, she told me after her final interview. Not in a normal way. Grant asked what you did, and when I told him real estate, he asked if that meant you were a realtor. What did you say? I said you own commercial property. He said, oh, so you're the breadwinner, then. Like it was a joke, but it wasn't really a joke. I should have paid more attention to that sentence. I didn't. I told her it didn't matter what her boss thought of me, because he wasn't the one I was married to. My brother Marcus disagreed with me about that, more than once, over the years. Marcus came down from Spokane for Thanksgiving 2 years ago, and I made the mistake of telling him, over beers on the back porch, about a comment Grant had made at that year's holiday party, something about how I probably handled Claire's overflow paperwork for extra cash. Marcus set his beer down on the railing hard enough that I thought it might crack. You let a man talk to you like that, he said, in front of her co-workers, and you just, laughed it off. It's not worth the fight, Marcus. It's her career. It's not her career if it's costing you your dignity every time you walk into that building, he said. Dad didn't build that house on Fowler Street so his sons could grow up and let some ad agency guy make jokes about them at Christmas parties. I'm not trying to prove anything to Grant Ashworth, I told him. I don't need his respect. Maybe not, Marcus said. But you're teaching him he can keep doing it for free. Men like that don't stop until it costs them something. You know that better than anyone in this family. You've built a whole career out of knowing that. I didn't have a good answer for him that night, and I still think about that conversation more than I've admitted to Claire. Marcus wasn't wrong. I'd spent years applying a hard-won business instinct, the instinct that told me exactly when a counterparty was bluffing and exactly when to let a bad deal walk away from the table, and I hadn't applied a single ounce of it to my own dinner table. I told myself it was because Claire's career mattered more than my ego. Looking back, I think it was easier to tell myself that story than to admit I'd simply been avoiding the discomfort of a confrontation I already knew, somewhere in my gut, was overdue. Ashworth Vane Creative occupies 4 floors of a building on 2nd Avenue in downtown Seattle. Grant Ashworth founded it 18 years ago after a career at a national agency, and by the time Claire joined, it had grown into one of the most respected mid-market creative shops in the Pacific Northwest, with clients that included 2 regional banks, a national outdoor apparel brand, and a healthcare system with locations across 3 states. Grant is 54 years old, tall, silver-haired in the deliberate way that men pay a stylist to maintain, and he has never in his life, as far as I can tell, doubted that he is the smartest person in any room he enters. I met him for the first time at Claire's 30th birthday dinner, which the agency partially sponsored because she just landed a 7-figure account. He shook my hand, held eye contact a half-second too long, and said, "So you're the real estate guy. What's that like, showing houses?" "I don't show houses," I said. "I own commercial buildings." Sure, he said, already looking past me towards someone more interesting. "Someone's got to do it." I let it go. I let a lot of things go over the next 4 years, because I've learned that the men who need to diminish other men in order to feel large are rarely worth the energy of correcting. Grant made comments like that every time I saw him. At the company holiday party 2 years ago, he introduced me to a client as Claire's husband. He's in property maintenance. At last year's summer picnic, he asked me, in front of 3 of Claire's co-workers, if I'd ever considered getting a real job now that Claire's carrying the household. Claire apologized for him every time. "He's like that with everyone," she'd say. "It's just how he talks." I believed her, mostly, because I didn't have a reason not to, and because correcting him would have meant making a scene at an event that mattered to my wife's career, and I've never been a man who needs an audience to know his own worth. But here's the thing about men like Grant Ashworth. They don't just underestimate you because they're careless. They underestimate you because it's useful to them. It lets them feel superior without doing any of the work superiority actually requires. And somewhere in the last 4 years, without me fully realizing it, Grant's condescension toward me had become part of the culture at Ashworth Vane. Claire told me things over the years that I filed away without acting on. That another director had once asked her, half joking, if I minded her making more money than me. That Grant referred to spouses at agency events as plus ones, except when he introduced his own wife, a hand surgeon, whom he always introduced by her full title. There were other moments over those 4 years that I've never told anyone about, not even Marcus, not even in the counseling sessions. At Claire's agency's spring retreat 2 years ago, held at a lodge on the Olympic Peninsula, Grant organized a partner talent show for spouses, where each spouse was supposed to demonstrate some skill for the group's entertainment. When it came to my turn, Grant, holding the microphone, announced me by saying, "And now, Nate's going to show us how to properly estimate a roofing repair," since that's basically his whole personality. I didn't have a talent prepared, because nobody had told me the game existed until we were already there, and I stood in front of 40 people from Claire's office with nothing to offer, while Grant filled the silence with another joke about my truck. At a client dinner the following fall, a client from the healthcare account asked me directly what I did for work, and before I could answer, Grant cut in and said, "Nate's in facilities. Keeps the lights on, so to speak." The client laughed politely and moved on, and I sat there for the rest of the dinner being introduced, silently, in my own head, as facilities guy, a title I never once corrected out loud because Claire had squeezed my knee under the table in a way that meant please, not tonight. I catalogued these moments the way I catalog underperforming assets in a portfolio review, quietly, without acting, waiting to see if the pattern would correct itself on its own. It never did. Each year, the jokes got a little more specific, a little more confident, because Grant had learned, correctly, that I would absorb them without pushback. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I never once needed Grant Ashworth's respect. I've built a portfolio worth more than his entire agency will ever be worth, and I've done it quietly, without a single mention in a business journal, without a LinkedIn post, without needing anyone at a cocktail party to be impressed. My father taught me that the men who talk the loudest about what they've built are usually the ones most afraid someone will ask to see the receipts. I've never needed anyone to see mine. What I needed, and what I didn't get for 4 years, was for the culture of that agency, and specifically for Grant Ashworth, to stop treating my wife's marriage as a punchline at company events. And what finally broke that, what finally forced the two versions of my life to collide in front of 140 witnesses, was the Ashworth Vane Foundation Gala, held annually to raise scholarship money for first-generation college students in King County, and held this year at the Sheraton Grand on 4th Avenue. I need to back up a little further, because there's a piece of this story that Grant Ashworth didn't know, that Claire didn't know, that almost nobody outside my own accounting team knew, and it's the piece that turned a humiliating dinner into the quietest, most complete correction of my professional life. 11 months before the gala, my company acquired a 6-story office building at 1201 2nd Avenue in downtown Seattle. It was a distressed asset. The previous owner, an out-of-state REIT, had overleveraged during a refinancing round and needed to offload the property fast to cover a margin call on an unrelated deal. I picked it up for $61 million, roughly 18% under market, through a holding entity called Bellwood 2nd Avenue LLC, a name that appeared nowhere near my own on any public document, because that's how commercial real estate works when you structure it correctly. Tenants sign leases with an LLC. They rarely know or care who stands behind it. Ashworth Vane Creative occupied floors 3 through 6 of that building. They had for 9 years, on a lease originally signed with the previous ownership group, a lease that was set to come up for renewal in 14 months. I did not know, when Bellwood 2nd Avenue LLC closed on that building, that Ashworth Vane was one of the tenants. I found out 3 weeks later, reviewing the rent roll with my asset manager, and I remember sitting at my desk on Western Avenue and laughing, a short, disbelieving laugh, because the universe apparently has a sense of humor after all. I didn't tell Claire. I want to be honest about why. Partly because I genuinely believed it wouldn't matter, that it was just a piece of paper in a filing cabinet that had nothing to do with our marriage. And partly, if I'm being fully honest with myself the way my father taught me to be, because some quiet part of me wanted to hold that card without playing it, the way you hold a strong hand in poker a little longer than you need to, just to see how the other side behaves when they think you have nothing. For 11 months, Grant Ashworth ran his agency out of a building I owned, paid rent to a company I controlled, and had no idea. And for 11 months, I watched him treat me like a man who mowed lawns for a living. The gala fell on the third Friday of October. It was Ashworth Vane's biggest annual event, black tie, $300 a plate, held to raise money for the Ashworth Family Foundation Scholarship, which Grant had started 9 years earlier and which had, by all accounts, done real good in the community, funding college tuition for dozens of first-generation students across King County. I want to say that clearly, because nothing about what happened that night changes the fact that the scholarship itself was legitimate, and the kids who benefited from it deserved every dollar. This isn't a story about tearing down something good. It's a story about a man who used something good as a stage for his own ego, and what happens when the wrong audience member finally stops playing along. Claire had asked me for weeks to be on my best behavior. Grant's been under a lot of pressure, she told me the Tuesday before the gala, sitting across from me at our kitchen table on Finney Ridge, a plate of pasta going cold between us. The agency lost the Cascade Bank account last quarter. He's stressed. Please just, if he says something, let it go. It's one night. I always let it go, I said. I know. I appreciate that. I just need tonight to be smooth. There's a partnership announcement coming, and I want him thinking about my work, not about anything else. I told her I'd behave. I meant it when I said it. I want that on the record, because everything that happened afterward, I didn't plan. I didn't walk into that ballroom looking for a fight. I walked in wanting, for once, to get through an evening without being the joke at my own wife's table. We arrived at 7:15. The Sheraton's Grand Ballroom had been transformed with white orchid centerpieces and a stage set up at the front for the evening's remarks and the live auction that would follow dinner. Claire looked stunning in a navy dress she bought for the occasion, and for the first 20 minutes, things were fine. Better than fine. Grant greeted us both warmly enough at the entrance, shook my hand, said something forgettable about the Seahawks, and moved on to the next set of guests. I actually let myself relax. I remember thinking, maybe tonight is different. Maybe Claire was right, maybe I'd been holding on to old resentments that didn't need to survive the evening. We were seated at table 6, near the front, with 2 of Claire's colleagues and their spouses, along with the agency's CFO and his wife. Dinner service began around 7:45. The conversation was pleasant enough through the salad course. Someone asked about my buildings and I gave the short, vague answer I always give at these things. I do commercial real estate. Nothing exciting. People generally take that answer at face value and move on, which is exactly why I use it. Grant did not take it at face value. He'd had 2 glasses of wine by the time the entree arrived, and something about the room, the applause he'd gotten during his opening remarks, the attention of 300 guests who'd paid to be there because of him, seemed to loosen something in him that had been held together by a thinner thread than I'd realized. "Nate," he said, from 2 seats down, loud enough that the whole table quieted to listen. "Commercial real estate. What's that mean exactly?" "You flip strip malls." "I acquire and manage office and retail properties," I said. "Even level." The way I always answer him. "Right, right." He nodded like I'd confirmed something. "See, I always wondered about that. Because Claire here," he gestured at my wife with his wine glass, "Claire's been carrying serious weight for us. 7-figure accounts. Client relationships that took years to build. And I look at you, and no offense, man, but I can't figure out what exactly you contribute. You know what I mean." The table went quiet in the specific way tables go quiet when everyone realizes something uncomfortable is happening and nobody wants to be the one who acknowledges it first. "Grant," Claire said, a warning in her voice. "I'm just saying," Grant continued, warming to it now, enjoying the attention the way a man enjoys applause he's mistaken for approval. "I've met a lot of spouses over the years. Doctors, lawyers, a guy who runs a hedge fund. And then there's Nate, who does, what did you call it, commercial real estate, which as far as I can tell means you collect rent checks and complain about tenants. No offense. Someone's gotta do it. A few people at adjacent tables had started to notice. I could feel the attention spreading outward the way a stain spreads through fabric, table by table, faces turning. "I think that's enough," Claire said, her voice tight now, embarrassment and anger fighting for control of it. "I'm complimenting the guy," Grant said, spreading his hands, playing the wounded innocent. "I respect it. Not everyone can go into a business that doesn't require much. Nate's smart enough to know his limits. He found a lane that works for him, and he's stuck with it. That takes a certain kind of self-awareness. Honestly, it's kind of admirable. You know your ceiling, and you don't try to push past it." "Grant," said the CFO, quietly, trying to redirect. No, I'm curious," said one of the account directors at the table, a woman named Priya who'd had enough wine of her own to lose her filter. "Nate, seriously, what does a day in your job even look like? Do you show properties? Do you have, like, an office?" "I have an office on Western Avenue," I said. "I spend most of my days reviewing lease agreements, underwriting acquisitions, and managing capital improvements across the portfolio." "Portfolio," Grant repeated, drawing the word out like it was a punchline in itself. "Listen to him. Portfolio. My guy, how many units are we talking? 10. 20. 14 buildings," I said. 14 units, Grant said, nodding along, clearly not listening, already moving toward whatever joke he'd built up in his head. "That's great. Honestly, that's a great little side business. My cousin does something similar, owns a few duplexes out in Kent, made himself a nice little retirement plan out of it. Good for you, man. Really." "Grant," said the CFO, quietly, trying to redirect. Grant wasn't finished. He'd found a rhythm, and men like Grant, once they find a rhythm in front of an audience, rarely stop themselves. "I mean, look, we're all here to celebrate the scholarship fund tonight, and I think about the mission of what we do. We give kids from nothing a shot at something. And I look at guys like Nate, and I think, that's a guy who probably needed a scholarship like this himself, growing up. No offense, man. I don't know your background. But you've got that look. That came from nothing and settled for less than nothing energy." I hadn't said a word. I sat there with my hands folded on the white tablecloth, and I watched Claire's face go through 3 or 4 different colors, and I felt something in my chest that I recognized immediately, because I'd felt it exactly once before in my life. The night a loan officer in Yakima told my father he didn't think a man who worked with his hands could responsibly manage a construction loan for the house he'd already half built with those same hands. My father hadn't argued with the man. My father had simply walked out, found financing somewhere else, and built the house anyway, and never once mentioned that loan officer's name again in the 20 years he lived in that house. I understand now, sitting here telling you this story, why I didn't raise my voice at that table. It's because my father taught me, the same way his father probably taught him, that the loudest response to being underestimated is not a response at all. It's simply becoming the kind of undeniable that a man like Grant Ashworth can't argue with, even when he desperately wants to. "Worthless," Grant said, and I want you to understand this was not a slip of the tongue, this was the word he chose, deliberately, in front of a table of 8 people and within earshot of at least 12 more. That's kind of the vibe, right? No offense. Some guys marry up and know it, and some guys marry up and think they're the ones doing the favor. At least you know which one you are. Claire stood up so fast her chair nearly toppled. "We're leaving," she said, to me, not to Grant. I put my hand gently on her wrist. "We're not leaving," I said, quiet enough that only she could hear it. "Not yet." She looked at me like she didn't recognize the calm in my voice, because it wasn't the calm of a man swallowing an insult. It was the calm of a man who had just realized, with perfect clarity, exactly what he was going to do next. The dinner service wound down around 9 o'clock. The lights dimmed and the evening moved into its live auction segment, which Grant emceed himself from a small stage at the front of the ballroom, working the room the way he clearly loved to, cracking jokes, calling out bidders by name, building energy for the scholarship fund's biggest night of the year. There were 11 items up for auction. A week at a vineyard estate in Walla Walla. Courtside Sonics tickets. A private chef dinner for 12. The final item of the night, the marquee item, was something Grant had clearly built the whole evening around: full naming rights to the foundation's flagship scholarship for the next 5 years, along with a permanent plaque in the agency's lobby, starting bid $200,000, all proceeds directly funding first-generation college scholarships across King County. "This is a legacy piece," Grant said into the microphone, scanning the room. "Someone in this room tonight is going to put their name on the future of a kid who doesn't have a dime to their name right now. $200,000 to start. Who's stepping up?" A hedge fund manager at table 2 opened at $200,000. A tech executive at table 9 came back with $210,000. The room did what rooms full of wealthy, competitive people do at auctions, which is turn philanthropy into a proxy war for status, each bid a little louder than the last, a little more performative. I raised my paddle at $220,000. I want to tell you I did it purely out of spite, but that wouldn't be entirely honest. Part of it was spite. I won't pretend otherwise. But a larger part of it, the part I've had time to sit with since, was that I looked around that ballroom at 140 people who just watched a man call me worthless to my face, and I thought about the kids that scholarship actually helps, kids who grew up the way I grew up, in houses their fathers built with their own hands, and I thought, if nothing else good comes out of tonight, that money should go where it's supposed to go. Grant's smile flickered when he saw my paddle. He recovered fast, the way men like him always do. "Nate. Didn't expect to see you in this fight." 220 from table 6. The tech executive at table 9 came back at $230. I raised my paddle again at $240. This time nobody else moved. $240,000, Grant said, and I watched him do the math in real time, watched the confusion cross his face, the same confusion I imagine crosses a man's face when a number simply doesn't fit the story he's been telling himself. 240 going once. Going twice. He looked directly at me, and for just a second, something like a genuine question passed across his expression, something closer to "Are you serious?" than his usual performative charm. Sold. To table 6. The room applauded. I stood up, walked to the small table near the stage where an event coordinator sat with a laptop and a card reader, and I asked her for a pen, because I don't do anything that size on a card. I wrote a check from Callaway Property Group's charitable giving account, for $240,000, made out to the Ashworth Family Foundation Scholarship Fund, and I signed my name at the bottom the way I've signed every check I've ever written, without ceremony. Grant walked over while I was signing it, still holding the microphone, still performing for the room even in this smaller moment. "Big number for a real estate guy," he said, low enough that it wasn't broadcast but loud enough that the people near the auction table heard it. "Where's that coming from, Nate? You sell a strip mall this week?" I finished signing the check. I folded it once, slid it into my jacket pocket, and I looked at him. "It's coming from the same place your rent's been coming from for the last 11 months, Grant," I said. "Bellwood 2nd Avenue." I watched his face change. I watched a decade of assumptions try to reroute themselves in real time behind his eyes, and I watched him fail to land anywhere solid, because there was nowhere solid to land. Bellwood 2nd Avenue LLC was the name on every rent invoice Ashworth Vane had received for almost a year. He knew that name. Every finance person at that agency knew that name. It was printed at the top of a wire transfer that left the company's account on the 1st of every month. "What are you talking about?" he said, and his voice had lost its stage register entirely. "I own your building, Grant," I said. "I have for 11 months. Your lease comes up for renewal in 14. I'd think carefully about how tonight went before we sit down to talk about that." I turned, walked back to table 6, and I said one sentence to Claire. "I'll be in the car." I didn't wait for her response. "I want to be honest about that too." Part of it was that I needed air, needed to be alone with what I'd just done before anyone, including my wife, could ask me to explain it or justify it or soften it. And part of it, if I'm fully honest, was that I wanted her to sit in that ballroom for a few more minutes and watch the room finish digesting what had just happened without me there to manage her reaction to it. I walked past the coat check without stopping. I walked past the valet stand and told the attendant I'd get my own truck, and I found it 3 levels down in the parking garage attached to the hotel. I sat behind the wheel with the engine off for 11 minutes, and I watched my own hands on the steering wheel, and I thought about my father, and I thought about a lone officer in Yakima whose name I genuinely could not remember anymore, and I thought about how strange it is that the moments that feel the biggest while they're happening are so often forgotten by everyone except the person they happen to. Claire found her own ride home. I know now that she stayed for another 40 minutes, that the room never fully recovered its rhythm, that Grant tried to salvage the closing remarks and the applause was noticeably thinner than it had been for the earlier speeches, that 3 separate people asked her, quietly, on the way out, whether it was true that her husband owned the building. Claire told me, weeks later, what those last 40 minutes in the ballroom had actually looked like from the inside. Because I'd already been sitting in the parking garage by the time most of it happened. She said the room never fully found its footing again after Grant walked off that small stage. The closing remarks, meant to thank major donors and preview next year's fundraising goals, ran short and flat, delivered by the CFO instead, because Grant had disappeared toward a side hallway with his phone in his hand for almost 15 minutes. 3 people came by table 6 during that stretch to ask Claire, carefully, whether it was true, whether her husband really owned the building, and she told me she'd answered each of them the same way. "I'll have to get back to you on that," she said, which was, at the time, the only honest answer she had. She said Priya, the account director who'd needled me earlier about my job, actually apologized to her on the way out, unprompted, saying she felt terrible about the whole thing and hadn't meant for it to go where it went. Claire told her it wasn't her fault, that this had been building for 4 years before that dinner ever happened, and Priya had gone quiet at that, the way people go quiet when they realize they've been an unwitting audience to something much older and much sadder than the single evening in front of them. Claire got a ride home from the CFO's wife, a woman named Renata whom she barely knew, and she said the 2 of them didn't talk much in the car, just sat with the radio low, both of them replaying the same 40 minutes in their heads from very different vantage points. By the time Claire walked through our front door, it was past midnight, and she told me she stood in the entryway for almost 10 minutes before she found the nerve to pick up her phone and call me, because some part of her already knew that whatever she said in that first sentence was going to determine what kind of conversation the rest of the night became. I was already home, sitting in the dark of our living room on Finney Ridge with a glass of bourbon I hadn't touched, when my phone rang at 12:14 a.m. "Nate," Claire said. Her voice was thick, wet, the voice of someone who'd been crying for a while before she worked up the nerve to call. "Nate, what did you do?" "I paid $240,000 to a scholarship fund," I said. "And I told your boss he's been renting his office from me for 11 months. Is that true?" Her voice cracked on the word true, like she was hoping, even now, that I'd say no, that this was some kind of misunderstanding, that the ground under her career hadn't actually shifted an hour earlier while she sat frozen at a table watching it happen. "It's true," I said. "Bellwood 2nd Avenue LLC is mine. Has been since last November." There was a long silence on the line. I could hear her breathing, uneven, and somewhere behind her, hotel ballroom noise, the specific murmur of an event trying to wind down gracefully after something has gone visibly wrong. "You let me sit there for a year," she finally said, "watching him make jokes about you, without telling me you owned his building." "I let you sit there for 4 years watching him make jokes about me," I said, "because you asked me to let it go, every single time, and I did. Tonight he called me worthless in front of 140 people at your company's biggest event of the year, Claire. I didn't plan what happened next. But I'm not going to apologize for what happened next. This is my career, Nate. Do you understand that? He's my boss. I have to walk into that office on Monday." "I understand that better than you think," I said. Which is exactly why I didn't say a word about the building for 11 months. I wasn't trying to blow up your job. I was trying to see if the man would ever, on his own, without being cornered, treat me like a human being instead of a punchline. He never did. Tonight he called me worthless to raise a laugh at a scholarship dinner named after his own family. I'm done pretending that's something I have to sit quietly through. She was crying harder now, the kind of crying that isn't really about the person on the other end of the phone anymore, the kind that's about every accumulated thing a person has been swallowing for longer than they've admitted to themselves. What happens now, she said. To my job. To us. What happens now? I don't know what happens to your job, I said, honestly. That's between you and Grant, and it always should have been. What happens to us depends on something else entirely. What's that? Whether you're finally ready to stop asking me to be smaller so other people feel more comfortable. She didn't have an answer for that. Not that night. We didn't sleep in the same bed. She stayed in the guest room, and I lay awake until almost 4 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, running the evening back over and over, trying to decide if I'd done something I'd regret or something I'd been owed for 4 years and had finally, at great and calculated cost, collected. I heard her moving around in the kitchen around 6:30 the next morning, earlier than either of us usually got up on a Saturday. I found her sitting at the table with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, still in the t-shirt she'd slept in, her makeup from the night before only partially removed, dark smudges under her eyes that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with crying. I've been up since 4, she said, without looking at me. I kept running numbers in my head. $240,000. That's more than I make in 3 years, Nate. You wrote that like it was nothing. It wasn't nothing, I said. It was deliberate. There's a difference. Deliberate how? Were you planning that? Did you know you were going to do that before you even walked into that ballroom? No, I said honestly. I didn't plan the auction bid. I didn't know Grant would say what he said, exactly, though I'd have bet money he'd say something. What I planned, 11 months ago, was not telling anyone I owned that building until there was a reason to. Last night gave me the reason. She was quiet for a long moment, turning the coffee mug slowly between her hands. Why didn't you just tell him the first time he made a comment like that? 2 years ago. 3. Why did you let it build for 4 years and then blow it up all at once? Because you asked me to let it go, I said. Every single time. And I loved you enough to keep doing what you asked, even when it cost me something every time I did it. I think some part of me also wanted to see if he'd ever stop on his own, without being forced to. He never did. Men like Grant don't stop until stopping is cheaper than continuing. So what? You were running some kind of experiment on my boss for 4 years. No, I said. I was being patient with a man who kept testing how much I'd absorb before I stopped absorbing it. There's a difference between that and an experiment. An experiment implies I enjoyed watching it happen. I didn't. I hated every single dinner, every single comment, every single time you squeezed my knee under a table to ask me, without words, to keep swallowing it for one more night. That landed harder than I expected it to. She set the coffee mug down and pressed both hands flat against the table, and for a while neither of us said anything at all, the kitchen quiet except for the refrigerator humming and, somewhere outside, a neighbor's dog barking at the mail carrier. I'm scared, she finally said. I'm scared of what Monday looks like. I'm scared of what people are already saying about us this morning. And I'm scared that some part of what you did wasn't really about defending me. I think some part of it was about finally getting to feel like the bigger man in a room where you'd felt small for 4 years, and I don't know how to feel about being the reason that room existed in the first place. I didn't have a clean answer for that, because it was true, at least partly, and I've never been able to lie to her convincingly even when a lie might have made a morning easier. You're not wrong, I said. Some of that's fair. I've had to sit with that too. But both things can be true at once, Claire. I can have wanted to stop feeling small in that room, and I can have been genuinely protecting you, and neither one cancels the other one out. She didn't say anything for a long time after that. Eventually she reached across the table and put her hand over mine, the first time she'd touched me since we'd left the ballroom the night before, and that small gesture told me more than anything either of us had said all morning. I called my father the next morning. He's 68 now, retired from construction 11 years ago, still living in the house he built in Yakima, and he's the only person whose judgment on a decision like this one has ever actually mattered to me. I told him everything. The dinner. The word worthless. The auction. The building. The check. He was quiet for a long time on the other end of the line, the particular quiet of a man who thinks before he speaks because he's learned that most words, once said, can't be taken back. Did you do it to hurt him, my father finally asked, or did you do it because it was true and it needed saying? Both, if I'm honest, I said. Then you already know the answer to whether you did the right thing, he said. A man who only ever does the honest thing when it happens to also feel good isn't much better than a man who never does it at all. But a man who tells the truth and it happens to cost someone something they deserve to lose, that man's got nothing to apologize for. Claire's scared about her job. She should be scared about something, he said. Question is whether it's the right something. She spent 4 years watching a man disrespect her husband and telling that husband to let it go for the sake of her comfort. Now the bills come due on that comfort, and she's upset it's expensive. That's not your fault, son. That's the cost of what she was buying. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. Monday morning, I got a call at 8:52 a.m. from a number I recognized, the direct line for Ashworth Vane Creative's chief financial officer, a man named Peter Kessler, who I'd met exactly twice, both times briefly, at agency functions. Mr. Calloway, he said, and I noted immediately the shift in address, the formal register replacing the casual dismissiveness his boss had used on me for years. I understand you're the principal behind Bellwood 2nd Avenue. That's correct, I said. I wanted to reach out personally, ahead of any conversation with Grant, because I think it's important the lease relationship stays professional regardless of, personal matters that may have come up socially over the weekend. I appreciate that, Peter, I said. I want to be clear about something, though, so there's no confusion going forward. My company doesn't make business decisions based on how a tenant's principal behaves at a dinner party. We make them based on lease performance, payment history, and market conditions. Ashworth Vane has been a reliable tenant for 9 years. That matters more to me than anything Grant said Friday night. There was audible relief in Kessler's exhale. I appreciate you saying that. Truly. That said, I continued, when your lease comes up for renewal in 14 months, we'll be reviewing market rates for the building, same as we would with any tenant. 2nd Avenue rents have moved considerably since your lease was signed 9 years ago. I'd encourage Grant to start budgeting for that conversation now rather than later. I want to be honest about what that sentence was. It wasn't a threat, not technically. Every word of it was true and defensible and exactly what any landlord would tell any tenant approaching a renewal in a market that had shifted. But Peter Kessler understood, and I understood, and if Grant Ashworth had any sense at all, he understood too, that I was not going to be the landlord who quietly renewed a below-market lease as a courtesy to a man who'd spent 4 years calling me worthless in front of my wife's coworkers. I never raised that rent by a single dollar more than the market justified. I want to be clear about that, because this isn't a story about a man abusing property leverage to settle a personal score. It's a story about a man who, for the first time in 4 years, simply stopped absorbing the cost of another man's cruelty on that man's behalf. When the renewal conversation happened 14 months later, Ashworth Vane paid exactly what the market demanded, the same number any other tenant in that building would have paid. It came to an increase of 11% over their previous rate. Grant Ashworth apparently told several people at the agency that his landlord had gouged him during renewal, which is a strange thing to say about a rent increase that was, if anything, slightly below the average increase every other tenant in the building absorbed that same cycle. But by then, the story he told himself about that number mattered less to me than it once might have, because by then, other things had already changed. Claire didn't lose her job. I want to be clear about that too, because I think some part of you reading this might expect a cleaner kind of revenge story, one where the boss gets fired and the wife gets promoted into his chair and everyone lives happily ever after with a bow on it. That's not what happened, because that's not how real workplaces or real marriages actually resolve. What happened was quieter and, in its own way, more complicated. Grant never mentioned the dinner again, not directly, not to Claire's face. But something in the agency's culture shifted after that night, the way a room's temperature shifts after a window's been left open even after you close it again. People at the office had heard. Not everyone was there, but everyone heard, because a story like that doesn't stay contained to 140 witnesses, it travels through an office the way any good story about a powerful man being caught flat-footed always travels, fast and with embellishments. Claire told me, about 6 weeks later, that a junior account manager had approached her privately to say she'd always admired how Claire kept things classy with Grant's comments over the years, and that watching him get quietly outmaneuvered had made her feel like maybe you didn't have to just take it forever. Claire didn't know what to say to that. She told me it was the first time she'd really understood that other people had been watching the dynamic between her and Grant for years and drawing conclusions about what was acceptable to tolerate in that office based on what she tolerated. The Monday after the gala was, by Claire's account, the strangest workday of her career. Nobody mentioned the dinner directly in any meeting, but the agency's open floor plan meant that almost everyone had heard some version of the story by 9 a.m., filtered through whoever had told it to them, each retelling slightly more dramatic than the last. By lunchtime, one version circulating held that I'd bought the entire building outright specifically to evict Ashworth Vane. Another held that Grant had been fired on the spot, which obviously hadn't happened. Claire spent most of the day fielding careful, sideways questions from coworkers who were clearly dying to ask directly and didn't quite dare. Peter Kessler, the CFO, pulled her into his office around 2 p.m. and asked her, as gently as he could manage, whether she'd known about the building ownership before Friday night. She told him the truth, she hadn't. He seemed to believe her, though she said his relief was obvious enough that she understood, in that moment, exactly how much professional exposure the agency's leadership suddenly felt they were carrying. Grant didn't come into the office that Monday at all. Or Tuesday. His assistant told anyone who asked that he was handling some personal matters, which fooled almost nobody. When he finally returned on Wednesday, Claire said he was quieter than she'd ever seen him, and that for the first time in 4 years, he didn't stop by her desk once, not even for the usual performative check-in he did with every account director on his way to the elevator each evening. It was like watching a balloon after someone finally let the air out, she told me. I almost felt bad for him. Almost. That conversation, more than anything I said to her, seemed to be the thing that finally landed. We went to marriage counseling starting the second week of November, not because our marriage was ending, but because I told Claire, plainly, in the kitchen on Finney Ridge on a Tuesday night with 2 plates of cold pasta between us, that I would not spend the next 30 years of my life being introduced as the guy who does something with rent checks while she stood next to me and said nothing. I know, she said. I know, Nate. I've known for a while. I think I told myself it wasn't a big deal because acknowledging how big a deal it was meant admitting I'd let it happen for years. Why did you let it happen? She was quiet for a long time before she answered. Because Grant built my career, she finally said. He gave me my first real shot, promoted me twice, taught me things nobody else in this industry was willing to teach me. I think some part of me decided a long time ago that I owed him a kind of loyalty that meant looking the other way when he was unkind to people who weren't useful to him. And I let that loyalty include you, which is the part I'm the most ashamed of. I appreciated the honesty. It didn't erase 4 years of silence at dinner tables, but it was a real answer, and real answers are worth something. Our counselor, a woman named Dr. Patel who has an office in Fremont with a view of the Ship Canal, asked us both, in our third session, to describe the moment at the gala from the other person's point of view. Claire described watching Grant call me worthless and feeling frozen, ashamed of her own paralysis, terrified of losing something professionally that she'd spent 7 years building. I described sitting there doing the math on exactly how many times I'd absorbed that kind of comment over the years in exchange for a peace that had never actually been peace, just postponement. What did signing that check feel like? Dr. Patel asked me. Like exhaling, I said, after holding my breath for 4 years. And walking out without waiting for Claire. Selfish, honestly, I said. I've thought about that a lot since. I don't regret the check. I've made peace with the confrontation. But I think some part of me wanted her to sit in the discomfort of that room a little longer, without me there smoothing it over, so she'd finally understand what 4 years of that discomfort had cost me every single time I did the smoothing myself. Claire cried in that session. Not the panicked crying of the midnight phone call, but something slower and more grounded, the kind of crying that comes from finally understanding something rather than from fear of losing it. The first session, back in the second week of November, Dr. Patel spent most of the hour just asking us to describe, separately, what a good marriage had looked like in each of our households growing up. Claire talked about her parents in Sacramento, both attorneys, a marriage built on parallel careers and mutual professional respect, where her father had never once, in 30 years, let a colleague speak dismissively about her mother in his presence without correcting it immediately, sometimes coldly. She said she hadn't realized until that session how strange it was that she'd never applied that same standard to her own marriage. I talked about my parents, my father's quiet certainty about his own worth, my mother's willingness to let him carry that certainty without ever needing to prove it to anyone outside the house. Neither of them needed an audience, I told Dr. Patel. But I don't think either of them would have sat quietly for 4 years while someone made jokes about the other one in public either. We kept going to Dr. Patel's office every other Thursday through the winter. In one of those sessions, in early January, she asked me a question that stuck with me longer than almost anything else that came up in those months. Nate, when you decided to bid on that auction item, were you thinking about Claire, or were you thinking about Grant? I sat with that question longer than I wanted to. Honestly, I said, in the moment, I don't think I was thinking about either of them. I think I was thinking about my father. About every time growing up that someone looked at him in his work boots and decided he wasn't worth listening to. I think some part of me has been carrying that on his behalf for 30 years, and Grant just happened to be standing in the wrong spot when it finally came due. Does that feel fair to Claire? Dr. Patel asked, letting a decision that big be shaped by something that has nothing to do with her. No, I admitted. It doesn't. I think that's part of what I owe her an apology for, honestly. Not the check. Not walking out. But the fact that I let 4 years of silence build up around something instead of naming it the first time it happened, back when it would have been a small conversation instead of a $240,000 one. Claire reached over and took my hand at that point, which she hadn't done in either of our first 2 sessions. I think I owe you the bigger apology, she said. I asked you to shrink for years because it was easier than standing up to a man who'd built my whole career. That's not on your father, Nate. That's on me. Dr. Patel let that sit in the room for a while before she spoke again. That's the first time either of you has said something true about your own part in this, instead of explaining the other person's part, she said. That's usually where the real work starts. We kept working. Some sessions were harder than others. There was one in February where Claire admitted, through tears, that some small, ugly part of her had actually been embarrassed by me over the years, not because of anything I'd done, but because of how easy it had been to let other people's opinions of me shape her own. That was a hard thing to hear across a coffee table in a therapist's office in Fremont. It was also, I think, the most honest thing anyone had said in 4 years of silent dinners and swallowed comments, and I respected her more for saying it than I would have if she'd kept protecting herself from admitting it. 6 months after the gala, Grant Ashworth resigned from the day-to-day leadership of Ashworth Vane Creative and moved into a chairman role. A transition the agency described publicly as long-planned, though 3 separate people told Claire privately that the agency's 2 largest clients had raised concerns with the board about Grant's conduct at company events after word of the gala had reached them through their own account teams who'd been present that night. I don't know how much of that is true. I don't take credit for it, and I want to be honest that I didn't engineer it. I signed a check and told a true fact out loud in a crowded room. What happened to Grant's career after that was the result of decisions other people made about what kind of behavior they were willing to keep funding. Claire was promoted to managing director 8 months after the gala, under the agency's new leadership, a promotion she earned on the strength of a client retention record that had nothing to do with me or with anything that happened that October night. I want to be clear about that too, because I don't want this story to sound like her success was some kind of consolation prize I engineered. She built that promotion with 14 years of work, most of it before she ever met me. I ran into Grant exactly once after that night, at a building industry mixer neither of us had realized the other would attend, held at a rooftop bar on Capitol Hill the following spring. He saw me across the room and, to his credit, walked over rather than avoiding me. "Nate," he said, extending a hand. I shook it. "Grant. I owe you an apology," he said, and I could tell it cost him something to say it, the particular discomfort of a man who spent 30 years being the one other people apologized to. What I said that night, it was out of line. I'd had too much to drink, and I think I'd built up some kind of story in my head about you over the years that let me feel comfortable saying things I never would have said to a stranger. "Why'd you need that story?" I asked, genuinely curious. He thought about it longer than I expected. "I think," he finally said, "watching Claire succeed the way she has, it made me feel like I needed someone in the room to feel bigger than. And you were quiet, and you dressed like you didn't care what anyone thought, and it was easy to decide that meant you didn't have anything to be threatened by. I was wrong about that. I think I was wrong about a lot of things that night." "You were," I said. I didn't say it unkindly. I said it the way you tell someone a fact they've already figured out on their own. "For what it's worth," he said, "the scholarship fund used that $240,000 to fund 6 full 4-year scholarships this year instead of the usual 2. Kids who wouldn't have gotten there otherwise. That's the only part of that night I don't regret without qualification," I told him. "We didn't become friends. I don't think either of us wanted that, and I'm not sure it would have been honest if we tried." But he shook my hand again on the way out, and something in that handshake felt like the closing of an account that had been overdue for 4 years. I told my father about that rooftop conversation the following weekend, sitting on his back porch in Yakima with 2 beers between us, the same porch where he'd taught me to throw a curveball I never really mastered and where, 20 years later, I still went when I needed to hear something plain and true said out loud. He apologized, I told him. Seemed like he meant it. My father considered that for a while, the way he considers most things, slowly, without rushing toward an opinion just because one was expected of him. "An apology after the fact is worth something," he finally said. "It's just never worth as much as the version where a man doesn't need 4 years and $240,000 to figure out he was wrong." "No," I agreed. "It's not. You did right by that scholarship money, though," he said. "Whatever else happened, 6 kids are going to college who wouldn't have otherwise. Your grandmother used to say the Lord's got a strange sense of timing, but he generally gets the accounting right in the end. I don't know if I believe all of that. But I believe the part about the accounting." Marcus came down from Spokane again that spring, and we didn't talk much about the gala directly, but at one point, sitting around the same kitchen table where he and I used to build houses out of paint chips 40 years earlier, he raised his beer toward me without a word, and I understood exactly what it meant, because we've never needed many words between us to understand each other. I think about Grant Ashworth less than you might expect, given how much space he occupied in 4 years of my marriage. I ran into him a second time, actually, about 8 months after the rooftop mixer, at a Mariners game of all places, both of us there with different groups, our seats maybe 30 feet apart along the first base line. He caught my eye during the 5th inning, gave a small nod, the kind 2 men give each other when there's history between them that doesn't need relitigating in a stadium full of strangers. I nodded back. That was the whole exchange. It felt, in its own quiet way, like the most honest interaction we'd ever had. Claire's relationship with the agency's new leadership has been, by every account she's given me, dramatically different from her years under Grant. Her new managing partner, a woman named Denise Farrow who came over from a larger agency in Portland, asked about me directly in Claire's first week under the new structure, not what I did for a living, but whether Claire wanted me included in the agency's annual client appreciation dinner list, since spouses were welcome to attend if they chose to. Claire told me later that the question itself, framed as a genuine invitation rather than an obligation, had nearly made her cry in the meeting, because it was the first time in 4 years someone in that building had treated my presence as a simple fact rather than a subject for commentary. I did attend that dinner, the following June, held at a restaurant on the waterfront rather than a hotel ballroom. Nobody asked me what I did for a living in a way that felt like a trap. Someone did ask, genuinely, out of actual curiosity, and I told them the real answer, plainly, the way I should have been telling people for years instead of hiding behind the vague deflection I'd relied on out of habit. I own and manage a portfolio of commercial buildings around the city, I said. About 90 million in assets, give or take, depending on the quarter. The person nodded, asked a follow-up question about cap rates, and the conversation moved on to something else entirely, the way conversations are supposed to move on when nobody in the room is trying to make you feel small for their own entertainment. Claire squeezed my hand under that table too, at some point during dinner, but it felt like a completely different gesture than the one she used to give me at Ashworth Vane events. That one had always meant please, don't make this harder than it needs to be. This one meant something closer to I see you, and I'm glad everyone else finally does too. I think about that night often, more than a year later now. Not with anger anymore, mostly. With something closer to clarity. My father used to tell me that the most dangerous thing you can do to a man like Grant Ashworth is nothing at all, for as long as it takes, until the moment arrives when doing nothing would cost you more than doing something. I didn't plan the timing of that auction paddle. I didn't walk into that ballroom looking for the moment. But when it arrived, I was ready for it, because I'd spent 4 years quietly building the exact kind of foundation that makes a man's cruelty come back to find him, whether he ever sees it coming or not. Claire and I are still married. We're better now than we were before the gala, which is a strange thing to say about a marriage that had to go through public humiliation and marriage counseling to get there, but it's true. She defends me now, openly, without hesitation, in rooms where it costs her something to do it. Last month, at a client dinner, a new business development director made an offhand comment about real estate guys that echoed Grant's old routine almost word for word, and Claire, without missing a beat, said, "My husband owns 9 figures of commercial property in this city and could probably buy this restaurant with the change in his truck's cup holder. Careful who you're joking about." I wasn't even there. She told me about it that night, and I think it meant more to me than the $240,000 check ever did. I've had a lot of time to sit with what that night actually cost, and what it actually bought, and I think the honest accounting looks something like this. It cost $240,000, which my accountant assures me was, from a pure balance sheet perspective, an entirely defensible charitable contribution regardless of the circumstances surrounding it. It cost 4 months of strained dinners at home before Claire and I found our way back to something steady. It cost whatever version of a professional relationship I might have eventually built with Grant Ashworth under different circumstances, though I've made my peace with never knowing what that would have looked like. What it bought was harder to put a number on. It bought 6 full scholarships for kids who needed them and would never know or care about the ugly circumstances that funded them, which strikes me as the closest thing to poetic justice this whole story actually contains. It bought Claire a workplace where she no longer has to calculate, before every comment out of her boss's mouth, how much of her own dignity she's willing to trade for her career that week. It bought our marriage an honesty it hadn't had in years, forged the hard way, through counseling sessions and difficult admissions rather than through some easier, cleaner path either of us would have chosen if we'd had the choice. And it bought me something I didn't fully understand I was missing until I had it, the simple, uncomplicated experience of hearing my own wife defend me in a room, without hesitation, without a warning squeeze on my knee under the table, without any calculation at all about what it might cost her to do it. I think about my father a lot in all of this, more than I think about Grant Ashworth, more than I think about the auction paddle or the check or the look on Grant's face when he did the math on Bellwood 2nd Avenue. I think about a man who built a 4-room house with his own hands over 3 years of nights and weekends, who never once needed anyone else to confirm what he'd built was real, and who somehow raised a son who spent 4 years needing exactly that kind of confirmation from a room full of people who had never built anything as real as what my father built, with a hammer and a level and a stubborn refusal to quit. I don't think I've fully become the man my father is. I don't know if anyone fully becomes their father, or if that's even the goal. But I think I got a little closer to it on that Friday night in October, standing at a small table near a stage, signing a check with a pen someone handed me, refusing to give a room full of strangers the satisfaction of watching me explain myself. That's the part of this story I actually want you to take with you. Not the building, not the auction paddle, not the moment Grant's face changed when he realized who his landlord was. The part where a marriage almost broke because one person kept asking the other to shrink for the sake of somebody else's comfort, and the part where it healed, slowly and honestly, once both people finally agreed that wasn't a price either of them should have ever been asked to keep paying. I signed that check because I was done being worthless in a room I'd already quietly built the foundation of. I walked out because some moments don't need an audience to be complete. And Claire called me crying at midnight because for the first time in 4 years, the cost of staying silent had finally, fully, come due, and neither of us could pretend otherwise anymore. Marcus called me the week this whole thing finally settled, once the lease renewal talks were behind us and Claire's promotion had been announced and something like normal life had started to reassemble itself around us. He didn't say much. Marcus never does. He just asked how Claire was doing, and when I told him she was doing well, genuinely well, he was quiet for a second and then said, "Dad would have liked how you handled it." Quiet. Didn't need anyone clapping for you. I think that's the truest compliment anyone's paid me out of this entire year, and it came from a man who's never once told me he was proud of me directly in 39 years, because that's not how our family says it. We say it in smaller ways. A raised beer bottle across a kitchen table. A nod at a baseball game. A check signed without a word, folded once, and slid into a jacket pocket on the way out the door. If you've ever sat at a table and let someone smaller than you make you feel small, I hope this reminds you of something my father spent his whole life trying to teach me: you don't need to raise your voice to prove your value. You just need to make sure that when the moment finally comes to show it, you're standing on something real. People ask me sometimes, when this story comes up among friends who've heard some version of it, whether I'd do it the same way again. Whether I'd sit on that building's ownership for 11 months instead of using it the moment I found out. Whether I'd let 4 years of small comments build into one large, expensive night instead of correcting the first one, back when correcting it would have cost nothing more than a slightly awkward silence at a Christmas party. I don't have a clean answer for that, and I think that's the most honest thing I can leave you with. Part of me believes patience is a virtue that eventually pays for itself, that a man who waits for the right moment instead of reacting to every small provocation ends up stronger for it, the way my father waited out that loan officer in Yakima and built the house anyway. Part of me also believes Marcus was right that night on the back porch, that letting cruelty go unanswered for years doesn't make you patient, it just teaches the person doing the cruelty that they've found a door that never locks. I think the truth sits somewhere between those two things, the way truth usually does. I don't regret protecting Claire's career for as long as I did. I don't regret the check, or the sentence I said to Grant on my way out of that ballroom, or the fact that I let a room full of strangers watch a man's assumptions collapse in real time. What I regret, if I'm being fully honest with you the way I've tried to be honest through this whole story, is that it took 4 years and a public humiliation to finally say out loud what should have been said quietly, privately, the very first time it happened. That's the lesson I'd actually want my own kids to take from this someday, if Claire and I are lucky enough to have them. Not that revenge feels good, though I won't pretend it didn't. Not that money solves everything, because it solves almost nothing that actually matters in a marriage. The lesson is simpler than that. Say the small true thing the first time it needs saying, while it's still small, while it still only costs you an uncomfortable 10 seconds at a dinner table instead of $250,000 and a winter of marriage counseling to finally set right. Drop a comment below. Do you think I handled it the right way, or would you have said something the second Grant opened his mouth? And if this story hit you, subscribe, because we tell real stories here, and we're just getting started.